This video is sponsored by Squarespace. I've never liked the movie Up. Don't get me wrong, this isn't any overly contrarian, grouchy hit piece. I do think it's a pretty good movie. There's obviously a lot to love here, and a lot of that we are going to talk about. But I've been going through making videos on all the Pixar movies, and of the ones I've talked about so far, I think I'm going to have to rank Up pretty low on the list. Up is a movie with a beautiful premise. An old man ties balloons to his house and flies away to visit the one place he and his wife always intended to visit. From the moment they met as children, Carl and Ellie both dreamt of going to Paradise Falls, set in Venezuela, due to their idolization with the explorer Charles Muntz. Only when Carl is finally able to afford 2 tickets, Ellie becomes sick and dies, and it is a beautiful and affecting montage. When people say they love this movie, normally they think of this montage that plays like 5-10 minutes in, and I get that, but my question is, firstly, what about the rest of the movie? How much of that do you remember? And secondly, I think there's even a problem with the montage itself that kind of undermines a lot of the movie to begin with. And then thirdly, I'm not sure people are entirely aware of what this film is actually trying to do. There's a big point I haven't heard anyone talk about before, and that's what we're going to do today. So strap yourselves in for another video in my big Pixar retrospective, and let's begin with a really cool train. So we will get back to the montage soon. It is obviously going to be very important to discuss, but let's first talk about, and perhaps remind you of the rest of the film. We're going to run through a bit of a summary of events, whilst also making a few positive points along the way, because as I said, there is a lot to love. So yes, we open with a young Carl watching a movie about his idol Charles Muntz, and then we see him playing at being Charles Muntz when he bumps into Ellie, who has the same interest. They get a couple of scenes to set their characters before the montage that then ends with Ellie's funeral. And then we see a very old Carl waking up, very slowly making his way down the house, having breakfast, sitting himself on the porch before this reveal, which did really get a laugh out of me. To be honest, I've only seen this film once before when I was 18 on a giant caravan holiday with like 8 other friends. One of them had been insisting on watching Up, so she put it on in the background and I was drunk at the time. I don't remember much at all about this film. So moments like this was a nice surprise and a nice reveal. I think this first sequence of old Carl sets things perfectly. We understand him. He deeply loved his wife and doesn't feel ready to move on, whilst the world here is literally trying to force him to move on. Very much wants to demolish his house, and they may see him as being stubborn for resisting, but they don't understand his perspective like we do. They think if we're paying for him to go to a really nice retirement home where he's going to get all the things he might need, why can't he just accept that? But this house was everything to him and Ellie. It's the exact house she drew a picture of as a child, and houses are hugely symbolic in general anyway. It's your place in the world, it's the space you've carved out that stands as a symbol for who you are and everything you've earned. When you're getting old and starting to question what you've done with your life, a house is a very tangible, solid thing you can point to and say, this is what I've done. I've made this home and it's going to stand there and it will still be there when I'm gone. This house is what's still standing of Ellie and what remains of everything they were, in a symbolic sense. At least that's how it can feel, and I think how it feels for Carl here. It can be super important for people, and it then does kind of depress me to think in another 30 years a large portion of my generation will be hitting old age without ever being able to own one. Russell knocks on Carl's door and he sends him away with some made-up mission to find an imaginary bird called a snipe that's been supposedly terrorising his home. Then he sees the builders accidentally damaging his letterbox and he reacts with pain and anger like they have literally trampled on the memory of Ellie. He hurts the builder, which all of them see, and we get this ominous shot of the boss staring Carl down through black shades, which is a wonderful decision by the way, so evocative to just make this character a silent, half-faceless figure just staring you down. He takes Carl to court for assaulting someone, and it puts Carl in a position where he'd have to accept the offer to sell his house. But then he thinks it's a dream he and Ellie always had to go to Paradise Falls, so right before he's supposed to leave his home, out come all of these balloons and off he flies. And there is the end to a beautiful, flawless short film. No, It turns out Russell was accidentally on the porch when he floated off, so Carl is forced to let him in. They hit a storm, Carl is knocked out while Russell flies, and they end up in Paradise Falls, basically. Just the wrong side of the fall, and they don't have enough helium to fly over, so they begin a long 3-day walk around the fall to get to the other side, where Ellie had always wanted her house to be. Which is then the big middle section of this film. On the way, Russell finds a bird he calls Kevin, and we find a talking dog called Doug, and there are other talking dogs that are villains and force our companions to the home of Charles Muntz, who is still alive. Charles, who was stripped of his honours when they thought the skeleton he brought back from Paradise Falls of this exotic monster was fabricated, that he had faked it, so he previously vowed to go back and not return until he had caught a live monster, therefore proving them wrong and restoring his honour. Charles has been stuck in Paradise Falls ever since, obsessed with catching this monster that just so happens to be the bird Russell had named Kevin, which just so happens to have been following them. Yeah, Charles is the villain. They try to help Kevin get away from his clutches, but fail. Carl has got his house to the spot Ellie wanted it to be, but it feels hollow now because of Kevin, and Russell is angry at him, and then we get a really sweet, still and silent sequence of Carl walking through his home, flicking through Ellie's old adventure book, until he gets to the section, Stuff I'm Going to Do. Carl has never flicked further into this book because that section was supposed to be for everything she did when they travelled to Paradise Falls. They have never been, therefore Carl assumes it is empty, except now he notices it's not. He turns the page and there is a picture of their wedding, of getting their house, of birthdays and trips to the park, and every sometimes minor, ordinary moment of their lives. Visually, it calls back to something Russell said of the sparse memories he has with his dad.
That might sound boring, but I think the boring stuff is the stuff I remember the most.
You know, life is not a list of big events. It's not a CD of your greatest hits that gets played through. It is an ever-expanding tapestry of every waking moment that all come together as their own adventure, their own dance, own story. Part of the reason Carl has struggled to process his grief is because he's felt like Ellie died with her life unfulfilled, incomplete. She never got to have that big adventure. For their house, this great symbol to reach the place it was meant to reach. But on the bottom of the page, she wrote this. Just being with him was the adventure, letting time unravel in the company of somebody you love. That is always the adventure that matters. Thanks for the adventure, now go and have a new one. So now Carl wants to go after Russell and Kevin. Carl realises he can make his house light enough to fly if he throws everything heavy out of it. He empties all these belongings, which is again a brilliant metaphor because these are objects that have been weighing him down, but also he doesn't need anymore. Don't encapsulate Ellie. He doesn't need to hold on to them in order to hold on to her. She's integrated inside him. Letting them go, he feels lighter. And so they chase after Charles, they free Kevin, Charles may or may not die, and the house floats away behind the clouds.
Sorry about your house, Mr. Fredrickson.
You know, it's just a house.
Processing grief. They now go back to America, and Carl turns up for Russell's Wilderness Explorer graduation scene when Russell's dad doesn't. And then the two of them sit on the curb eating ice cream and counting all the red and blue cars, exactly as Russell said he used to do with his dad.
Then we sit on this one curb right outside, and I'll count all the blue cars, and he counts all the red ones, and whoever gets the most wins.
And we end with a shot of the house, which has now landed exactly where Carl had intended, back by Paradise Falls, where it will likely stay for many years. That's the film, and you'll notice I talked very positively and meaningfully about it there, so in which case, what exactly is my problem?
I would like to award you the highest honor I can bestow. The
Squarespace.
Edge.
Wow.
Yep, this video is sponsored by Squarespace. Anyone building and growing their own website or online business, this is the all-in-one platform you need. Designing a website, linking with business email, integration, securing your domain, built-in SEO tools, personalized marketing campaigns, email campaigns, analytics, invoices, booking schedules, contact forms, donations, and everything else. It's all here. I've been building my own website on Squarespace to promote my editing services, but also I've been making a shop page to sell my poetry book. This footage is all me building it from scratch without the need of any tutorials. I find it all so intuitive, add elements, drag and resize everything smoothly on this grid system I really like, change the colours, add pictures, build a nice contact form, and then publish. Yeah, this website is live now. Thanks to Squarespace, I was able to build the exact site I wanted and sell my book without any of the expected hassle. So, if you want the best domain name at an all-inclusive price, if you want integrated SEO tools, if you want a giant scrolling list of all the things Squarespace offered, then click the link in the description or the pinned comment for a free trial to Squarespace. And if it suits you nicely, then use the code MyLittleThoughtTree to get 10% off purchasing your first domain or website, just like I did. Squarespace. Well, the thing is, in between those really good beats of Carl flying to Venezuela, Carl throwing stuff out of his house, and then Carl watching it drift behind the clouds, does anything else matter? There is a lot of stuff happening in this movie, a lot of plots that I've completely glossed over, where we got talking dogs and endless chase scenes and fight scenes and slapstick moments that I don't think entirely add up with what this movie is attempting to be. And to be clear, I like slapstick humour. I like chase scenes and fight scenes when they fit. The last Pixar video I talked about was Ratatouille, and it had a lot of mad action happening all over the place. Some of the best bits from The Incredibles are action sequences, but they fit there. They're fun whilst also enhancing the story. When it's an old man running from a load of characters that don't really have much to do with the core of this story, you know, a story about one man's grief as he tries to move forwards in life, lots of sequences where they flee from a pack of talking dogs or sneak onto a blimp, don't contribute anything to that character other than a bit of fun action for itself, and therefore they feel a bit substanceless, which makes those scenes feel like a drag, despite how well they're actually made and how fun they should be. 2/3 of this film is a murky middle section of Carl and Russell running away from things as they traverse the wilderness. And if you want that to work, you need to be using that time to really explore them as characters and explore their feelings. Curiously, I think even for a kids' film, there are very little scenes devoted to their growing bonds. There is one quick moment where Carl realises Russell's parents are divorced, and then one slightly longer moment where Russell shares a fond memory of eating ice cream with his dad, where they count the red and blue cars that pass. But that's mostly it between them. The bonds and character interactions between Russell and Carl don't feel like a focus here. You know, road trip movies where it's two different characters stuck together for a long period of time need a lot more exploration between them for it to feel fulfilling, let alone actually exploring grief. There could be a lot of complexity to Carl's feelings, a lot of complexity to grief, but we never really get any of it. We get 3 really good scenes. The montage at the start, Carl flicking through his adventure book, and then Carl watching his house float away. But those 3 scenes don't constitute a movie, especially when there's not a huge amount in between to really not just tie them together, but build up to those scenes, make them land as impactfully as they deserve to. Kevin, Doug, Charles himself all feel like an annoying distraction from what should be the real meat of this movie. To such an extent, it becomes a dull hour of just stuff happening while we wait for Carl to realise the point of the story. A point, by the way, I realised during the opening montage. You see this important jar of savings for Paradise Falls not only get smashed a load of times, but slowly put to the side. They're dancing in the foreground while it's just an ornament buried on a shelf. Even watching this during the montage, I stopped to scribble in my notes. The thing they really wanted to do with their lives was to share it. It was never about filling the adventure book, because this montage is literally already that. This is cycling through the pages of their adventure. And you know, to realise that within the first moments of this film, and then have to endure ages and ages of stuff that aren't really important just to finally get to the point of that, the payoff later on, feels a little bit frustrating. I think the core issue with this movie is that it's a Pixar film made for kids. For it to really deliver on the premise it sets up, this would probably need to be an older film, I think. It would need lots of time to slowly wade through the mud of an aging man's grief, and doing that just wouldn't be as appealing for an audience of children, which is perhaps why we do get just a few short scenes. So, you know, it's still a very good movie for children, and when children are the main demographic, we shouldn't devalue the importance of that, but still as an overall film, as a family film, I suppose, I think it's less successful. As a movie in general, I'm not sure we needed Charles Muntz at all, or even a villain. It seems an odd creative decision to have a load of talking dogs and this old adventurer appear to try and hunt down this bird that's attached itself to Carl and Russell, which is another issue, by the way. Kevin also feels like a spare part. If we take the basic trope here, normally there's just one companion who is annoying, but it is also the one our grouchy old man needs to protect from some other danger, you know? In The Last of Us. Ellie is the annoying but lovable Russell, and also the semi-MacGuffin that the villains are after, or is at least in danger. Ellie in that story is both Russell and Kevin. Splitting them into two characters here of Kevin and Russell, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but the problem is Kevin never gets to mean a huge amount personally to Carl, because he never gets to bond with the birds. There isn't the same amount of time for that. Russell is the one doing that. And therefore, Carl's decision to go and save Kevin never feels as personal. Therefore, what Kevin means in this film is never as palpable for our main character. And secondly, because the plot is more about the danger to Kevin, there's less in the story to draw out Carl's protective instincts towards Russell, less to really tighten their dynamic. Russell is put in some danger near the end, but it doesn't feel as much like a focus and doesn't really, make the bonds between these two a massive, important aspect of this story. Either I think you'd need a lot more time for Carl to bond personally with both of these characters, or you would need to incorporate them into a single character. Up strikes me as a film where they had the solid outline of some really good emotional beats, but never tied the whole lot together tight enough so that they could each land with a real crescendo. Even in retrospect, I did tear up at the opening montage, of course I did, but it doesn't particularly stick with me. For something so universal and meaningful, it should stick with me more. Instead, I feel sort of cheated into my tears, that it's a scene manufactured for tears, and not one that earns that through something more substantial. To be honest, the bit of it that really got me was just seeing the cut from them painting a baby room to Ellie crying in hospital, and that's probably because I've literally been painting our own baby room this week. It's a good montage, but it feels designed to pull on the heartstrings. It is perhaps the opposite of everything I said of Ratatouille last time. That film was very subtle in its approach to the emotional beats, really earns their payoff, where here they very forcefully swing a giant emotional sledgehammer, and then never particularly build on what it sets up. So, as a slightly drunk 18-year-old, I never thought that much of Up. The film came out in general when I was 15 years old, and my snobby, pretentious phase of artistic taste had started then, so I was likely too negative on this film back then. Rewatching it yesterday, knowing I was a pretentious teen when I first saw it, I was ready for my opinion to completely flip, ready to fall in love with a story my younger self too readily dismissed. And I don't hate it. It is good. But for all the care that's gone into such a well-made film with a really cool premise, it never delivers on that potential at all. However, I am not yet done. There is something else I still need to say about this film. I said Charles Muntz is a really odd creative decision, but if you look at what this film is really about, it does make sense, and what it is about is the questing beast. Yeah, the questing beast is a creature that popped up in a lot of different medieval or Arthurian myths. This strange, only half-known creature that many knights went on quests to try and capture or hunt, and a lot of different things obviously happened in a lot of different myths, but generally it is some creature that evades them or seems forever impossible to catch. Potentially the beast was originally modelled on ideas of giraffes, which would have seemed insane creatures to a medieval European, and we can obviously see the similarity between that and Kevin. There are a lot of other stories or ideas that draw on this general concept, such as the snark in Lewis Carroll's nonsense poem The Hunting of the Snark, where of all the people hunting for it, they never entirely know what it is, and the one person to actually ever find it suddenly vanishes altogether. And actually, one episode of the murder mystery show Lewis served as a really interesting adaptation of this, where a man who has spent years and years obsessed with this poem, believing there is a secret Da Vinci Code style meaning to it, and only when he feels like he's getting close to cracking that, he is suddenly mysteriously murdered, to which Lewis and Hathaway are on the case to unravel the crime, and in its course they come across a mother whose son died of a drug overdose that she can't accept, and so insists there is some other hidden explanation. And she spent years trying to puzzle out what must have happened to him, and as a scientist attempting to discover a cure to his wife's illness before she dies, and all sorts of other examples that form an episode all about people trying to hunt for some finite, solid answer to all of their grief, something that will magically solve everything. When perhaps this mother should have been obsessing less over her son's death than reflecting on his life, and the scientist could have been spending his last years cherishing the time he had with his wife, rather than shutting himself away in a lab. This is just one interpretation of that idea, but the point I'm making with this tangent is that that's very similar to what I think Up is saying. The journey to Paradise Falls is Carl's own questing beast, where if he reaches the falls and sets the house there, everything will be magically complete for him, everything will have its answer, life will be totally fulfilled both for Ellie and for himself. But of course that's not how life works. Charles Mance has torn up his entire life chasing after his own questing beast in Kevin. This singular thing that will restore all of his honour and complete all of his life's work. The hunt has totally consumed him, until it's all that's left of him as a person. And then he is finally, potentially, killed in the pursuit. Kevin is not meant to be captured. They discover later on she is a mother with babies she needs to get back to. Not only is this film making a colonialist point about it being wrong to capture these creatures and treat the wildlife of Venezuela like their own personal playground, but it is also the point that the questing beast should not be caught, and that doing so will not fulfill you. You should let it go and discover the true quest. The true adventure was never about the answer, but always about the journey itself.
In the midst of the word he was trying to say, in the midst of his laughter and glee, he had softly and suddenly vanished away. For the snark was a boojum, you see.
The beauty of Carl and Ellie is that they did put their questing piece aside on a shelf in order to enjoy life. You know, the older you get, the more you want your life to have some meaning. Carl both wanting that for his own and for Ellie's life to have meant something concrete he can hold on to and point to. We all want to feel like we are leaving something behind, and there is nothing wrong with that impulse at all, but it still shouldn't come at the expense of truly living and truly enjoying the now. Every little joyful or peaceful or even sorrowful moment already matters as your own life, without having to neglect its value in order to try and hunt for some greater meaning out there. Thematically, the idea of the questing beast is what ties all of this film together. That's what makes Charles fit, despite the fact a young Carl idolised him. You know, there's very little personal elements to their conflict, which is weird considering that, but there is at least this thematic idea. Both men are hunting their own questing beast, and only one of them learns to let it go. So, I do want to contradict my criticisms by saying that Charles does fit, there is a point, but it's not incorporated well enough, I don't think, to actually feel like it matters unless you really look. And to be honest, you could have still made that point without a ton of distraction. I think I'd have much preferred a version of this story where Charles was already dead, where they come across these dogs of his that have seemed to have bred and found their own way of surviving, and Carl and Russell find the ruins of his old dirigible, and through the setting itself you can express that idea a lot more succinctly. Just having Carl wander through the scattered remains of Charles's old hunt. An eerie foreshadowing of what might become of Carl if he doesn't change, which I think would better open space for Carl to actually reflect on his own idol and what he amounted to, as well as to reflect on his own life. But yeah, where am I ranking this one in the context of all of that? Well, most of the films so far I've rewatched are big hitters, so I think this one does have to go behind them, despite it not being a bad film. There's so many good films already up here. With the list so far, I think this has to be 9th. Yeah, that's where I'm putting it for now. It'll be interesting to see how it positions when all of the films have been finished in this list. But what do you think of this film? Well, as ever, I put out a poll so that we can compare results across films, and of the 2.7 thousand votes at the time of recording this, 48% of you said it was brilliant, 37% said it was good, and 7% said it was a bit flawed, which, doing the same bit flawed but consistent maths I do every video, that works out at 211 points out of a possible 276, which works out at 76%. And that is actually the lowest community score so far for these films, apart from A Bug's Life. So I guess we're all in agreement on this film, actually. Or are we? That's just one quick poll, so comment your thoughts, good or bad, on the film, on the video itself. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe, maybe support me on Patreon or buy me a coffee, or check out my poetry book that you can buy straight from my own website. In fact, just check out the website. But otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And as ever, a special thank you goes to Flying Spider, Luke Core, Michael Gallagher, Emery, Faithy, TQM, Kinesthetic, Chad Bramwell and Joshua C. Follier. Thank you.